some of the rules of war, and perhaps the one that's most preserved is the rules against assassination. It seems like it was developed by leaders to make sure that their asses are safe. And yet, sometimes the most effective way to end a war would be to take out the guy who's like it seems okay to fire on 18-year-old kids who are conscripted and thrown into the front lines, but not the guy who's ordering them to kill people. And where did that idea develop, and why is it so sacredly respected?
Good question. Andrew?
Yeah, thanks. Excellent question. If you look at the laws of war and how it relates to the principle of distinction, the principle of distinction tells us that we're allowed to, in the context of an armed conflict, to target combatants and not civilians. Now, as we get to the higher and higher echelons of government, it becomes less and less clear sometimes as to who is a combatant and who is not. For example, is the Queen of England a combatant by virtue of being the commander-in-chief of the British Armed Forces? Is President Obama a combatant by virtue of being the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces? These are difficult questions. What we can say clearly is that anybody who is a civilian is protected from attack in that context. And that would mean that, for example, Parliament in a particular country, or Congress in the case of the United States, would be a civilian infrastructure that makes, it has all kinds of indirect influence on the conflict, but is not actually pulling the trigger themselves, and therefore they're protected against direct attack. So the concept of assassination is more or less a political term, and you might ask philosophical questions as to whether assassinating the leader of a country is going to quickly end the conflict. The answer from a strictly legal standpoint is that civilians are protected, combatants are not within that context.
You're using the rule to justify the justness of the rule. My question is, why is that rule so well respected when other rules of warfare are not?
Well, I'd like to say that the other rules of warfare are also respected in accordance with what's possible on the battlefield. But I mean, these are questions about the applicability of the existing legal framework. I'm just telling you what that framework is, and I agree that there are many issues of interpretation on that law. The fact that I said, for example, that Parliament would be exempt from being targeted, some more hawkish people would say, no, they are in fact legitimate targets. So I'm giving you a Red Cross opinion on that particular issue.
And this might be one question on which the legal part and the philosophy part could diverge, because from the philosophical perspective, one of the questions would be, if you could take out someone who is protected under the laws of armed conflict, but in doing so, you could shorten the conflict, lead to less death overall, you might think that would be preferable, right, to having a more protracted conflict. And this was one of the questions that Brad raised in his introductory remarks. Yeah, so I just wanted to raise that.
It occurs to me as an operator, guy has to make these decisions, that there's always a frustration. I feel your pain, I feel your frustration, I've had it over issues like that. But I'm a glasses half full guy, not a glasses half empty guy, which is to say, this is a regime, the set of governance procedures that we've been talking about, they work okay in some places, they work really well in some places and not well in other places, okay? But it's across the entire spectrum of violence. So that same discussion could happen with regard to the issue of, on the battlefield specifically, gee, we're gonna use this rule and not degrade private so-and-so's body after he dies, or not? Well, you know, they don't do it, why should we do it? Social justice requires fairness, we ought to be able to do what they get to do. No, this is about us, this is why we do things, okay? It's constant discussion with regard to these. There's thousands and thousands of Iraqi soldiers, for example, in the first Gulf War, very happy that the law of war exists. They got to become POWs rather than get blown up. In that case, it worked. In other cases, not so well.
Ma'am, and I would encourage our panel to answer quickly so that we can try to get to all the questions.
This is an observational question, and a question that I've had over my lifetime. Watching skirmishes in summer parks, looking at educational programs in correctional institutions, looking at violence in sports, And forgive me today, seeing no woman's voice on this panel today. Where has the concept
We did
of
have
gender...
women, and they had to leave early.
Okay.
Family emergencies.
Just an observation. Where has really we have been looking at research in the gender play to this question, testosterone's play to this question, people who are making decisions, mostly men. Where is the woman's voice truly in the thinking for the future being played out that you see or would recommend or would, forgive me, allow to truly be present as we move forward in the future?
I agree completely with that. It appears disproportionate, and it still does not reflect the civil population of gender in our panel. Shannon French was here. She could only stay for a day, unfortunately, due to responsibilities. She's the head of the Inamori Center at Case Western Reserve University, and we missed her greatly. Charlie Carpenter, a professor at the University of Massachusetts, that's Charlie with an I, not an IE, in this case, was here up to this point in time. But as you mentioned, family conditions required her to come. The real issue is, and I'm going to throw this back to my ICRC colleagues as well too, how much deliberation indeed is based on the generation of the laws of war at that particular perspective. But the panel was, in my estimation, quite proactive in terms of trying to ensure fair, as much as we could, gender representation in this particular space. But your point is well taken.
I think the broader response to that is that the laws of war have two perspectives. One comes out of a very strong and powerful history. The second comes out of what a culture chooses to adopt as representing its best interests and highest ideals. To that extent, the way to influence these kinds of activities is through the political process. Once you get embedded in the kinds of things we're talking about, you become locked into a limited perspective, not just in terms of gender. You will notice most of the people on this panel come out of a Western tradition. If I were from another tradition, say maybe Confucian, I might have some concerns about that. We recognize the limitations both within this dialogue and the broader dialogue that goes on in society, and part of what we want to do is to use this as a beginning to go beyond that. So those kinds of observations are well taken and important. Thank you. Sir.
I think everybody here has great admiration for this panel. But my question is, assuming the thinkers in this think tank somehow consolidate your thinking sometime in the future, wherever you say that might be, what influence are you going to have, and what methods are you going to use to impart your conclusions to the world?
So I will let the panel respond, but my response is, in part, that's exactly what we're trying to do today. That's what we're trying to do by pulling together people from very different groups. We have some academics. I mean, you always have to have academics, particularly if you ask an academic to put the panel together. I mean, come on. But we have the International Committee for the Red Cross. That is a very, very powerful organization. They keep a very low profile, as they have to, because of the activities they do. Some of their people are in Syria today. So they have the ability to take what they hear here and take it back to their organizations. We have the National Academy of Sciences and National Research Council. That provides new ideas in that perspective. We are talking to Slate about putting together a series of short articles which would go online. Some of us have blogs. So your question is a very, very difficult one to answer precisely, because what we need to figure out is how to best get the kinds of things we're thinking about into a broader dialogue. And you all, frankly, are part of that. That's why we're doing this. Many of you have roles in your local communities. You may not come, if you come out of this with any kind of clear idea of what we should do, please tell me. But now you know these are important issues. Now you can understand that perhaps the laws of war are something that are not just, shouldn't be thought about just by the military. To your point, these are very critical. They should be thought about by every citizen. How do we do that? We're working with that. We would like this to be the first of many efforts trying to do that.
I once had a faculty mentor say to me, it's better to know some of the questions than all of the answers. And what we're trying to do, what we really try to do here, we don't have any answers to any of the questions that we gave out to you. That's why we gave them to you. We were trying to develop questions, serious questions. That's the beginning of what we would like to think is the beginning of wisdom. How that gets out into the public, well, I don't know, but we know that if they have all the answers and they don't know what the questions are, they're going to continue without us. And so our attempt is just to develop some questions, some good questions first.
One additional comment, if I could, and that is your question may have two parts. One's the procedural one. What are we going to publish, or are we going to write 95 points up on a piece of paper and parchment and hammer it to the door of the National Cathedral or the White House or something? Cool. We could do that. The other, though, is a credibility question. So who the heck do you guys, mostly guys, the gals have gone, who do you think you are, and what positions of influence do you have that would make anybody who's empowered to do anything, take you seriously? And I think this is where your participation here becomes very important. In 1532, if I may bore you with an historical anecdote, a professor stood up and gave a lecture at his university, the University of Salamanca in Spain, based on the readings that all the students in the university had been doing that semester on Aquinas. And based on those lectures, he concluded in two famous treatises that what the Spanish conquistadors was doing in the conquest in America was illegal, a violation of international law. Now you might think, that's a pretty dangerous thing for a guy to do. The man's name was Francisco de Vitoria, and he published books on the laws of war and on the question of the American Indians. And he denounced most of the tactics and most of the policy that the Spanish government was pursuing. So that might have got him killed, except that he happened to be a good friend of the king, who invited him to Seville to talk about the issues, and that had a tremendous impact on the way in which the Spanish at least reflected on whether or not their policies could completely be justified. Didn't stop the conquest, didn't stop the genocide, it didn't stop the untractable forces of history from eventually transforming South and Central America, but it did show, I think, that there is a tremendous impact that public discourse, whether on landmines, the Ottawa Treaty, or on questions of robotics or the use of predators and drones for targeted assassinations, can have when that conversation is directed and focused. That's part of the interesting feature of, I think, international law and the just war tradition, is it arises from reflections by people like ourselves on the practices we're commonly engaged in carrying out. Can we do this? Should we do this? What will we do to change our minds and affect our leaders' policies?